The Beginning of Belonging by Arunmayi Ma. There's a thread that runs quietly through my life. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just persistent. It begins with knowing. From a very young age, I knew I was different. Not in a way I could explain. Not in a way that sounded like I was born in the wrong body. That wasn't necessarily my experience. It was subtler than that, more atmospheric. I experienced myself in a way that didn't match the reflection being handed to me. There was an internal texture to my identity that didn't line up with the role I was expected to inhabit. But I didn't have language. I just had sensation, awareness, a kind of quiet misalignment. And I grew up in an Old Testament Baptist environment where gender was not a poetic thing. It wasn't layered, and it definitely wasn't fluid. It was decree. It was structured. It was presented as divinely fixed. And anything outside of that structure wasn't neutral. It was moral failure. There was subtle demonization of queer people. Very specific demonization of transgender women. Enough so that I absorbed the message without anyone needing to say it directly. Deviation from gender norms wasn't complexity. It was rebellion against God. When you're a child and you feel different in a way you cannot articulate, and the environment you trust implies the difference is sinful, something happens internally. You don't question the system, you question yourself. So I learned to split. I didn't feel wrong in my body. I felt wrong in the reflection. I learned to monitor my movements, to flatten impulses, to regulate softness, to perform a version of masculinity that felt externally acceptable but internally foreign. And that split followed me into adolescence. When I left for college, it was like stepping out of surveillance. For the first time, I felt space. I felt the absence of constant moral framing, and I ran with it. Freedom tasted sharp and electric. I leaned into the rebellion. I rejected the masculinity I had been handed because it felt rigid and inhospitable to my nervous system. It felt like armor I had been forced to wear for years. So I took it off. But rebellion wasn't clarity. It was reaction. The real shift didn't come from running away from my upbringing. It came when I stopped running long enough to sit with myself underneath it. When the noise quieted, when I stopped defining myself in opposition, something steadier emerged. There was a name for what I had always experienced. And when I found that name, it didn't feel like invention. It felt like recognition. I didn't transition to become someone new. I transitioned to stop abandoning someone who had survived quietly for years. At first, I leaned fiercely into femininity. It was reclamation. It was a full-body yes to something that had been demonized within me. It was both defiance and tenderness. But over time, my experience of gender became more layered, less reactive, more integrated. Some days I moved through the world in softness, adorned, pretty, but there's a masculine undercurrent. Not threatening, not rigid, just present. Like a pretty boy wrapped in silk. Other days, it's grounded, sapphic, even butch in tone. Not a costume, not performance. A different configuration of the same self. And what's important is this. It doesn't flip on a dime. It shifts gradually. Like weather patterns moving across a landscape. I don't experience gender as a switch. I experience it as a fluid field. And I move through that field over time. I used to think legitimacy required fixedness. That to be real, I had to choose a side and anchor there permanently. Now I understand that integration looks different. I'm no longer rejecting masculinity outright. I'm metabolizing it. Separating toxicity from essence. Allowing myself to embody strength without rigidity. softness without apology. And as that internal integration deepened, another layer surfaced. Longing. Longing for a relationship, for shared life, for intimacy that is not theoretical, for friendship that isn't limited to distance and abstraction. There's a particular ache in witnessing closeness from the outside, watching people share history, physical proximity, casual belonging. And I have had to sit with that ache without collapsing into shame, because longing can so easily turn into self-criticism, into why don't I have that, into what is missing in me. But I've come to understand longing as evidence of aliveness. And this is where Ram Dass enters the story. He became, for me, a loving father figure and spiritual mentor wrapped into one. I say that carefully, because I grew up with a version of authority that felt fused with moral threat, masculinity that felt watchful, corrective, and rigid. And then I encountered a presence that felt entirely different. Through his voice, his teachings, his guided meditations, there was warmth without control, guidance without domination, love without evaluation. There have been moments in meditation where I have wept deeply, not because I was broken, not because I was confessing something, but because something in me felt safe. It felt like being fathered without being corrected. And for someone raised in rigid religious masculinity, that is no small thing. He taught me what unconditional love is. Not indulgence, not bypassing, not pretending suffering isn't real, but the willingness to sit with what is present without aggression, to allow complexity without trying to compress it. He modeled a masculinity that was not threatened by tenderness, and slowly, that external tone became internal. The child who felt misaligned is included. The adolescent who's split is included. The college rebel is included. The woman reclaiming herself now is included. The longing, the loneliness, it's all included. Nothing gets exiled. Ram Dass didn't give me identity. He gave me a way to relate to myself. He showed me that love doesn't begin after purification. It doesn't arrive after you fix yourself. It doesn't require you to narrow your complexity into something socially digestible. Love is not a reward. It's a ground. And what he taught me, what still brings me to tears when I sit in meditation, is simple. Love is just as you are. No prerequisite, no performance, no theological approval. Just this. And from that ground, I'm learning how to approach my own longing differently. Not as deficiency, not as desperation, but as something sacred. I still want partnership. I still want friendship. I still want embodied connection. But I'm trying to approach these desires from a place of already being held, already being loved, already being enough. I'm still learning, still integrating, still moving across that internal spectrum. But I'm not running anymore. And for me, that's the beginning of belonging. Thank you for listening.